The ranch sprawled across miles of jagged, wind-swept terrain, a patchwork of dry grass, hardy shrubs, and weathered fencing. Situated far from the nearest town, it was a place where silence wasn't just present. It was absolute, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the pines or the distant cawing of a lone raven. The land had belonged to the rancher's family for generations, and he knew every rock, every hollow in the soil, and every hidden trail the wildlife used to move unseen across the property. To outsiders it was desolate. To him it was home, a harsh but honest home that demanded respect and rewarded patience. The rancher himself was a man carved from the landscape, his face lined from decades of sun and wind, his hands calloused and strong from years of hard labor. He had learned early that solitude wasn't loneliness, it was survival. When he woke before dawn each morning, the chill in the air bit at his skin like a warning, yet he welcomed it. It reminded him that the world outside the cabin walls was indifferent to human presence. He could feel that indifference in the soil, beneath his boots, in the untamed rivers that cut through the hills, and in the mountains that rose like silent sentinels along the horizon. Life here was raw, stripped of pretension or comfort, and it had shaped him into a man who trusted action over words, instinct over superstition. Despite the isolation, or perhaps because of it, the rancher had a routine that anchored him. Each morning, he would inspect the fences, ensuring no wild animal or wandering human could breach his carefully maintained boundaries. He would check the water troughs, fill the feed bins, and walk the land on horseback, watching the livestock as much for their safety as for the reassurance of their presence. These routines were simple, repetitive, yet they were rituals that tethered him to a world he understood and controlled. He took pride in the predictability of his days, the rhythm that allowed him to live free of dependence on anyone else. The ranch was not just a livelihood, it was a fortress, both physical and mental, against the chaos of the outside world. Yet even in such isolation, the ranch carried its own secrets, whispering reminders that no place is entirely safe. There were old tales passed down by his grandfather about the property being cursed or haunted by spirits of those who had died in tragic accidents on the land. Most of these stories had faded into the realm of folklore, dismissed by the practical rancher as superstition. Still, sometimes, in the deep silence of night, when the wind shifted and the shadows fell in strange patterns across the hills, he could feel a presence watching from just beyond the tree line. It was an instinct honed over years, a prickling awareness that told him the world, even here, was not entirely under his control. He had long ago accepted the uneasy companionship of these whispers. They were part of the land's history, the lingering echoes of those who had walked here before him. And yet the isolation that once felt like protection had also become a kind of prison, a fragile balance between safety and exposure. The rancher thrived on his solitude, but it had its costs. Loneliness was a constant gnawing presence, and in the dead of night, the dark corners of the cabin seemed to deepen, as if the shadows themselves were waiting for him to let his guard down. Into the cold gray dawn, he would mount his horse, feeling the familiar tension of muscles and leather beneath him. The ranch stretched out endlessly, empty but full of life that obeyed him and in return offered a sense of purpose. Here, he was master and servant both, bound to the land and bound by it, carrying the weight of its secrets and the solitude it demanded. He didn't realize that today, the balance of his isolated world was about to be shattered, and the quiet authority he wielded would be challenged by a presence that did not belong. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sharp tang of pine and dust. The rancher had been tending the northern fence line when he first saw her, a figure stumbling along the ridge, half hidden by the rising fog. At first he thought she might be a lost hiker. People sometimes wandered onto the property, though rarely survived the isolation for long without help. But as he drew closer, he saw that she was more than just disoriented. She was injured. One arm hung awkwardly at her side, blood streaked her clothes, and her gait was unsteady, as though each step was an effort. She noticed him too, and her eyes widened. Not in recognition, but in something else. Fear? Relief? He couldn't tell. All she could manage was a whisper. barely audible over the wind. "Let me die here." The words hit him like a blow. At first he thought he'd misheard. Who in their right mind would ask to die on a ranch? Yet there was a desperation in her voice that made him pause. His survival instincts wrestled with his conscience. He had built his life around control and predictability, but here was a human element he couldn't ignore. She wasn't just injured, she was vulnerable in a way that the land had taught him to respect and fear simultaneously. He dismounted, keeping his voice calm and steady as he called to her. "Come here, I can help." She hesitated, trembling, but eventually allowed him to support her as he led her to the cabin. Her weight was almost ghost-like, and the rancher couldn't help noticing how quiet she was. Too quiet. Not a word about who she was, where she came from, or how she had ended up wandering alone on this harsh terrain. Every question he asked was met with the same whispered refrain, "Let me die here." Inside the cabin, he settled her on the worn couch near the stove and fetched a blanket. She accepted it without a word, her eyes hollow, dark, and fixed somewhere beyond him, as if she were looking past the walls, past the world entirely. The rancher examined her injuries, scrapes, bruises, dried blood, but nothing immediately, life-threatening. Yet the way she moved or didn't move suggested a deep fatigue, as though she had been running from something for days. Despite his careful observation, unease began to creep in. The animals, normally docile, refused to come near her. The dog growled softly, ears pinned back, and even the horses seemed skittish when she walked past the barn. He had raised these animals for years, and he trusted their instincts. When they reacted this way, it was more than mere chance. Something about her presence unsettled them, and the thought prickled at the edges of his mind. The rancher tried conversation, asking her name, where she had come from. She offered only vague gestures or sometimes a slight shake of her head. He noticed small details, the way her fingers twitched, how her lips sometimes formed words she didn't speak aloud. There was an unnatural stillness about her, a quality that set her apart from any human he had ever known. Night fell, and the rancher found himself on edge. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind rattling the windows made him glance at her. She was sitting in silence, watching the shadows crawl along the floor, unmoving. For the first time, he realized that this woman was no ordinary traveler. Something about her, some essence or aura, did not belong in the world of the living, and yet she was here, pleading for refuge in a voice that suggested both life and despair. He had taken in many strangers over the years, but none had unsettled him like this. The storm of questions that swirled in his mind, who she was, why she was here, and what exactly she meant by "let me die here," could not be ignored. In the quiet of the isolated ranch, where he had always been master of his domain, a new variable had appeared, one he neither controlled nor fully understood. And for the first time, the rancher felt the fragile certainty of his world beginning to crack. The following days on the ranch were like nothing the rancher had ever experienced. The woman remained largely silent, her whispered insistence, "Let me die here," echoing in his mind long after he had heard it. At first he tried to treat her like any ordinary injured traveler, tending to her wounds, offering food and water, and keeping her warm. But subtle details about her behavior began to unsettle him in ways he could not ignore. She avoided mirrors. Whenever the rancher accidentally caught her gaze in the small cracked mirror in the cabin, she flinched violently, turning away as if confronted with something intolerable. He initially dismissed it as trauma, a residual fear of her injuries or the unknown dangers she might have fled. Yet even in moments when no mirrors were present, her reaction to reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, or the polished metal of his tools was the same. It was as if she feared seeing herself, or perhaps feared being seen. Animals reacted to her in ways that defied explanation. The dog, normally loyal and obedient, would curl up in the far corner of the cabin whenever she moved close. The horses shied away from her when she entered the barn, ears pinned back and nostrils flaring. Chickens scattered at her approach, and even the barn cats, fearless creatures accustomed to intruders, hissed and arched their backs. The rancher had raised these animals his entire life. He knew their instincts were usually reliable. Whatever, this woman was the creatures instinctively recognized a danger he could not yet name. Her movements were another puzzle. At times she seemed entirely human, shuffling unsteadily when injured, leaning heavily on walls for support. But in other moments, there was a fluidity that defied explanation. Her shadow sometimes moved slightly out of sync with her body, and her footsteps were eerily quiet, muffled to the point that he could hear her presence before he saw her. When she slept, her chest rose and fell, but the rhythm was inconsistent, almost imperceptibly unnatural, like the cadence of a clock running too fast or too slow. Even her eyes unsettled him. They were dark and unblinking, staring into the distance, as though perceiving something beyond the cabin walls. He caught her watching empty corners, hallways, and the shadows at the edge of the forest. She never seemed to follow him with curiosity or awareness, only a distant focus, as if locked onto a scene invisible to him. The intensity of her gaze gave the rancher a creeping sense that the world he understood so well was incomplete, that some hidden layer of reality existed just beyond the reach of his perception. At night, the unease deepened. The wind moaned through the cracks in the cabin, carrying with it strange noises. Faint whispers, the sound of dragging feet outside, and the occasional thump of something falling. He would glance toward the woman, expecting to find her asleep, only to see her, sitting perfectly still, eyes wide and unblinking, her expression impossible to read. She never flinched at the noises that unsettled him, as though she was aware of them but unconcerned, aware in a way he was not. Despite all this, the rancher could not bring himself to turn her away. There was a vulnerability to her, a palpable sense of suffering that demanded his attention and compassion. Yet the more he cared for her, the more the sense of dread grew. Something about her presence was wrong, profoundly so, and it made the walls of his cabin feel smaller, the open, ranch land less safe. He had always believed he was the master of this land, able to anticipate its dangers, but this woman was a variable he could neither control nor predict. And so the rancher found himself walking a delicate line. He tended her injuries, offered her food, and sheltered her from the elements, yet every interaction left him questioning her very nature. Was she human, or something else entirely? Was the fear she inspired in the animals and in himself a warning, or merely an echo of his imagination? The answers eluded him, and with each passing day the tension thickened. The woman's silence, her strange behaviors, and the subtle but pervasive sense of unease became the rhythm of his life, a rhythm he knew was steering him toward a revelation he was not yet prepared to face. Nightfall on the ranch had always been a predictable ritual, but with her presence it became a test of endurance, patience, and nerves. The wind had grown sharper, slicing through the gaps in the cabin walls like a cold knife. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, twisting unnaturally as lantern light flickered against them. The rancher tried to dismiss the unease that gnawed at him, attributing it to fatigue, but every creak of timber and rustle from outside made his heart jump. He had weathered storms and prowling predators, but tonight there was something different, an invisible weight pressing against the edges of his senses. The woman remained mostly silent, sitting in the corner near the stove, her dark eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. Occasionally she would shift her gaze toward the windows, where the fog thickened into ghostly shapes that danced just beyond the glass. The rancher caught himself glancing repeatedly, trying to convince himself it was just mist and moonlight. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. It was not the ordinary vigilance of wild animals, it was something more deliberate, more calculating. Then came the whispers. At first he thought the wind carried voices from distant trees or perhaps the groaning of the old cabin. But the sound grew clearer, almost syllables strung together in faint, incomprehensible murmurs. They seemed to echo inside the walls, sometimes behind him, sometimes around him, and always faintly from the corner where she sat. His instincts screamed that these were not ordinary sounds, that the ranch was alive in ways he had never experienced. That night he checked the barn. Livestock huddled together in unnatural clusters, their eyes wide, reflecting the lantern's light like tiny beacons of fear. Nothing had triggered them, no predators, no noises he could detect, but their panic was palpable. The rancher's unease deepened. He had always trusted his animals' instincts, and right now their collective terror seemed to confirm the unspoken truth. Something about the woman's presence was wrong. Small, inexplicable events began to accumulate. Tools he had left neatly stacked would be overturned by morning. Footprints appeared in the soft soil outside, yet when he followed them, they vanished without trace. Even the fire in the stove behaved oddly, flames flickering against the wind, sparks leaping as if repelled by some unseen force. Each incident alone could be explained away, but together they wove a tapestry of unnatural disturbance that no rational mind could ignore. The woman's behavior also became stranger. She would occasionally speak in whispers, not to him, but to something unseen, fragments of phrases, words that made no sense yet carried a tone of pleading, warning, and pain all at once. At times she would rise abruptly, moving to a dark corner of the cabin, her fingers brushing along the walls as if searching for something hidden. The rancher tried to approach her, but she would retreat silently, almost gliding, her eyes flashing, with a strange awareness he could not comprehend. One evening a storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled like distant cannon fire, lightning illuminating the cabin in harsh, fleeting bursts. In one flash he saw her standing in the doorway, soaking wet, yet her hair and clothes appeared untouched by rain. For a split second, she seemed to flicker like a shadow cast by an uneven light, and then she was gone. He ran to the porch, searching the yard, but there was no trace, only the relentless wind and the heavy pulse of his own fear. By the end of that night, the rancher felt the walls closing in. The land that had once been his sanctuary now seemed alien, hostile, and alive in ways he could not predict. Every creak, every gust of wind, every distant howl of animals on the hills carried a new weight, a message he could not decode. And, at the center of it all, she remained calm, seated near the stove, whispering, eyes dark and unblinking, waiting for something, or someone. He realized then that his life, his carefully ordered solitude, had been irrevocably disrupted. The ranch was no longer merely a home or a refuge. It had become a stage for events beyond his understanding, where the natural rules he relied on no longer applied. Something ancient, something restless, had arrived with her, and it was only a matter of time before he would be forced to confront it directly. The days that followed the storm were heavy with a tension the rancher could not shake. The woman remained quiet, but her silence had taken on a new weight. It was as if she carried knowledge of something the world had forgotten. Her eyes, always fixed on something beyond his comprehension, seemed to follow movements the rancher could not perceive. At times he swore he caught glimpses of shadows shifting around her, responding to her presence as though the very air bent to her will. He began to notice small but unsettling inconsistencies. Her injuries, he realized, were curiously superficial in some areas and impossibly deep in others. A gash on her arm would appear fresh one day, only to seem partially healed the next, without treatment. Bruises shifted location, and even the smallest scratches on her clothing seemed to regenerate, as though time itself refused to leave its mark on her. The rational part of his mind struggled against the evidence, but each anomaly made it harder to dismiss the growing unease. Then came the photographs. He had found them tucked into an old trunk while cleaning the cabin. Black and white images of people he did not recognize, some familiar only in the vague sense of memory he could not place. And there she was, identical, down to the expression, frozen on her face in one photo dated decades earlier. One image showed a family gathered on the very ranch he now called home, and in the back, barely visible, was the same girl, standing apart from everyone, staring directly at the camera. The rancher's hands trembled as he studied the photo. It was impossible and yet undeniable. Objects in the cabin began to shift inexplicably. The rancher would leave tools on the workbench, only to find them moved or overturned hours later. Food would vanish from containers only to reappear in odd corners. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of her reflection in polished surfaces, but the reflection would linger for a heartbeat too long, or move independently, leaving him blinking in disbelief. Even the animals, previously cautious, now seemed openly fearful, refusing to enter rooms where she had been, keeping their distance with unnatural vigilance. He tried to speak with her, to force answers from her lips, but each question was met with silence, or the same haunting phrase, "Let me die, here." Yet there was an undertone now, almost imperceptible, as if she were pleading not just for death but for understanding, for release. The rancher began to suspect she was bound by forces he could not comprehend, caught between life and something, far older, far stranger. Then he discovered the first real clue to her nature, a hidden compartment in the cabin floor, covered by a loose plank. Beneath it lay items that suggested the ranch had a darker history than he had ever imagined. Worn journals, ritualistic symbols carved into wood, and remnants of garments that matched hers in style and pattern, but decades old. The journals spoke of tragedies, deaths, and unnatural events on the ranch, all of them tied to a figure much like her, arriving repeatedly, always pleading to die here. The realization struck him like a physical blow. She was not just a lost traveler, she was part of the ranch itself, intertwined with its history in ways he could not yet explain. Perhaps she had lived and died here countless times, a repeating echo of a curse or a memory too persistent to fade. The unease that had been building over days crystallized into fear. She was something beyond human, and her presence was a warning. That night, he found her standing at the edge of the woods, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the fog clung to, the hills. She did not move, though he called to her. Then in a voice barely above a whisper she said, "They never let me stay." The words carried a weight that made the rancher's blood run cold. For the first time he understood. Whatever she was, whatever bound her to this land, it was tied to death, to history, and to something ancient and restless that refused to let her go. And the rancher, isolated and unprepared, was now caught in the middle. The cabin had never felt smaller. Shadows pooled in corners and the wind rattled the windows as if insisting on entry. The rancher's hands, calloused from decades of labor, were unsteady for the first time in his life. Days of observation, worry, and creeping terror had brought him to a point where he could no longer ignore the truth he had been chasing. She was not a simple victim of circumstance, nor a wandering soul in need of help. There was something else in her, something alive yet unearthly, and it demanded confrontation. He approached her cautiously, the floorboards creaking under his weight. She sat by the stove, the dim light flickering across her pale skin, making her appear almost translucent. Her eyes followed him, dark and unblinking, yet calm in a way that was profoundly unsettling. What are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the quiver in his chest. "Why are you here? Why do you say you want to die?" For a long moment she said nothing. The silence was suffocating, pressing against his ears until he felt his heartbeat in his temples. Finally she rose, her movements fluid and unnaturally smooth, and walked to the center of the cabin. "If you want to know," she whispered, voice low and trembling, "you must see." Her hands moved to her dress. At first he thought she might be gesturing toward her injuries as though revealing the truth of her suffering. Hesitantly, the rancher stepped closer, curiosity battling fear. She allowed him to lift the fabric. The sight froze him instantly. What lay beneath was not simply a collection of wounds or scars. It was a glimpse of something that should not exist. Portions of her skin were pale and almost translucent, showing veins in intricate, unnatural patterns. Other areas revealed what looked like decay, as though she were both alive and in the early stages of death simultaneously. The effect was horrifying, yet mesmerizing, and the rancher could not look away. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The air around her seemed heavier, charged as if the room itself recognized the revelation. The silence was thick, broken only by her whisper, "They never let me die. Not here. Not ever." The rancher's mind raced. He had encountered death before, Seen it in animals, seen it in men and women who wandered too far into the wilderness. But this was something else entirely. She was bound to the ranch, to its history, to something older than himself, older than the land. And yet there was despair in her eyes, a pleading that made the terror knot in his chest feel almost compassionate. "Then what are you?" he asked again, voice barely above a whisper, trembling. "Are you human?" Her lips quivered, and for the first time she let her mouth form more than words. "I am trapped," she said, her voice carrying both sorrow and warning. "Bound to this land. Each time I die, it is not the end. And I cannot stay where I wish. You cannot help me, only bear witness." The rancher felt a chill crawl along his spine. The room, the ranch, the very air around them seemed to shift. Shadows flickered. The wind howled louder, and the fire in the stove leapt as though startled. He realized then that the woman was more than a victim or a wanderer. She was part of something vast, supernatural, and unyielding. An echo of past tragedies tied inexorably to this land. Fear and responsibility collided in him. He wanted to flee, to abandon the cabin and escape into the night. Yet some part of him, the part that had spent a lifetime mastering the land, felt compelled to stay, to understand, to witness, to face the unknown head-on. Her gaze locked with his, imploring and hopeless. "Please," she whispered, "let me die here." And in that moment, the rancher understood. Whatever else had happened in the past, whatever horrors she had endured, the choices he made from this point forward would determine not only her fate but the safety of the ranch and perhaps his very sanity. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Every shadow lengthened unnaturally as the rancher stared, frozen, at the revelation before him. What he had glimpsed beneath her dress was only a fragment of the truth. As he tried to comprehend it, the air thickened, charged with a presence that pressed against his skin like invisible fingers. The room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in to contain something monstrous, yet familiar. Then it moved. Not with the fumbling gait of a human, but with fluid, almost ethereal grace. She lifted her arms slightly, and for a moment the rancher could see beneath her skin, not just the decay, but something writhing inside her, like threads of shadow intertwined with faintly glowing veins. They pulsed with a rhythm all their own, independent of her heartbeat, independent of any natural law he had ever known. Her eyes met his, wide and dark, yet filled with pleading. "It is too late for me," she whispered. "Too late to die as I wish. But you—" Her gaze swept the cabin, flicking to the barn, the loft, and the edges of the woods. "You can see. You can bear witness." The room grew colder. Frost formed along the window edges, though the night outside was clear. A low, rattling hum began in the walls, like the sigh of 1,000 trapped voices. The rancher's pulse thundered in his ears. Every instinct screamed to run, but his feet were rooted. He could not look away, could not retreat from the horror that had walked into his life. Suddenly, the figure before him shifted. The skin, decayed and translucent, seemed to ripple as if something beneath it stirred independently. Her hands extended, and the air between them thickened with shadows that clung and pulsed, forming shapes just beyond comprehension. The dog barked and whimpered in the corner, refusing to approach. Hair bristled along its spine. The horses in the barn stamped and neighed, their panic echoing across the property. Even the wind seemed to howl in warning. The rancher's mind raced. He had prepared for storms, wild animals, and the unforgiving wilderness. But this was beyond the realm of survival. She was not merely ill, not merely human. She was a manifestation of the land's hidden curse, of being caught between life and death, reality, and something far darker. And yet, the plea in her eyes held him. "Let me die here," she repeated, voice quivering with both despair and intensity. Something inside him compelled him forward. Against every fiber of fear, he reached out. The moment his hand brushed hers, a jolt of cold ran through him, a sensation that was part electricity, part shadow. He glimpsed the ranch's history in fragments: charred wood, fallen bodies, rituals performed long ago, and countless cycles of her arrival and death. Every iteration had ended the same: an impossible struggle against forces that refused to release her. Her lips trembled. "You see it now," she whispered. "The others could not help. I am tied to this land, to the soil, to the shadows. Every time I die, I return, until someone truly sees." The rancher staggered back, gasping, yet the fascination held him fast. The woman, or what she had become, was both victim and entity, a living embodiment of centuries-old despair. The shadows swirled around her, coalescing into forms that hinted at figures long dead, echoes of previous tragedies. They moved toward her but recoiled from him, as though acknowledging his presence yet deferring to the impossible bond she carried. The room seemed to pulse with an unearthly rhythm. Time itself felt malleable, stretching and snapping back as if the night were alive. The rancher realized with chilling clarity that he was witnessing a being caught between worlds, human enough to command his empathy, inhuman enough to terrify beyond measure. And she had chosen him, not as a victim, but as a witness. As the shadows writhed and the wind screamed against the cabin walls, the rancher knew there was no turning back. Whatever she truly was, whatever bound her to the land, it had revealed itself entirely. And the echoing plea, "Let me die here," was no longer just words. It was a command, a warning, and a key to surviving the night he had stumbled into. The night had deepened into something he could not name. The wind whipped violently against the cabin, rattling the windows with a force that made the walls shudder. Outside, shadows stretched and warped, dancing across the uneven ground in shapes that suggested movement without origin. The rancher's muscles tensed, every instinct screaming that danger was imminent. Yet his eyes remained locked on her, the woman who was no longer entirely human, no longer fully alive, yet undeniably aware, pleading in ways that pierced his resolve. The shadows coiled around her, writhing like serpents of smoke, forming vague, sinister shapes that resembled figures from a past long buried. The dog cowered in the corner, ears flat, growls vibrating low in its throat. Even the horses outside, normally indifferent to the cabin's inner life, pawed the ground, their eyes wide with panic. Something was coming, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for a moment like this, and the rancher realized he had become part of the equation. He could flee, of course. The cabin door beckoned, and beyond it stretched the familiar, open terrain he had mastered for years. He knew every ridge, every tree line, every hidden hollow. Running might save his life, but he also knew that whatever this was, it would not stay behind. The land itself seemed alive, aware of her presence, aware of him. If he left, the horror might follow, uncontained and unrestrained, and the woman's voice, "Let me die here," would echo endlessly in his mind, unanswered. The alternative was confrontation, to stay, to face her, and whatever force bound her to the ranch. His rational mind balked at the idea, but some deeper, unspoken instinct told him that running would not resolve anything. She was trapped in a cycle of death and return, bound to the property by something ancient, and he had a role to play. Perhaps he could end it, or perhaps he would become another witness, another link in the chain of the land's cursed history. "Tell me what to do," he whispered, voice shaking. His hands trembled, the weight of fear and responsibility pressing down on him. Her dark eyes softened, and for a moment, she was more human, more vulnerable than terrifying. "You must choose," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You can try to end it, or you can survive by understanding it. But neither is simple. Both carry risk." The shadows thickened, responding to her words as if the world itself awaited his decision. The fire in the stove flickered, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Dust swirled in the air, forming subtle, shifting patterns that seemed almost like writing, though he could not read it. The rancher's mind raced, searching for a solution, any solution. Every instinct told him to flee. Every thought told him to act. But the choice was impossible to ignore. Then she moved closer, her steps fluid, her presence drawing him in. The threads of shadow that had surrounded her twisted, lashing outward as though testing him, probing his resolve. "Do not fail me," she whispered, her voice both command and plea. "This is your moment. Act wisely." The rancher's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that whatever he decided would either break the cycle or bind him to it forever. He could attempt to confront whatever force animated her, the shadows, the unnatural decay, the cycles of death, and risk everything, or he could retreat into the night, hoping to survive but knowing he would carry the weight of failure, and the horror might follow him beyond the safety of his familiar terrain. Every instinct, every lesson from years of solitary life on the ranch, collided with the impossible reality before him. The choice had become undeniable: fight or flee. Each option was fraught with danger, each carried consequences he could not yet predict. He swallowed hard, feeling the cold air clawing at his lungs, and took a step forward. And in that moment, the rancher realized that there was no turning back. The night, the land, and the woman had forced his hand, and the first move he made would determine not just his survival, but the fate of the haunted ranch itself. The wind had become a roar, rattling the cabin with the fury of something ancient and relentless. Shadows writhed across the walls, flickering in the lantern light as if they were alive, stretching and twisting into grotesque forms. The rancher's hands were steady now, though his heart hammered with anticipation and fear. He had chosen to stay, chosen to confront the impossible, and there was no turning back. The woman, no, the entity she had become, stood at the center of the cabin, her form pulsing with the eerie, half-decayed glow that had frozen him in horror days before. The shadows that surrounded her seemed to bend and respond to her will, as though she were the axis around which the supernatural forces of the land moved. Her eyes met his, imploring, commanding, and full of ancient sorrow. "It's time," she whispered. "End it, or bear witness." The rancher's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments he had discovered. The old journals hidden beneath the floorboards, the photographs showing her presence across decades, the ritualistic symbols carved into wood and stone, all of it pointed to one truth. The land itself was cursed, tied to cycles of death, grief, and unresolved tragedy. She had been caught in these cycles countless times, a living echo of something that should have been at rest. He realized then that confronting her was not about destruction, it was about recognition and release. He knelt before her, tracing the symbols he had found in the journals, reciting the names and events recorded within them. The air thickened, the shadows recoiling slightly as if disturbed by his act. She whispered fragments of encouragement, guiding him with her voice, teaching him the rhythm of acknowledgement and respect that the curse demanded. The cabin trembled. Dust fell from the beams and the fire flickered violently, casting grotesque leaping shadows. Figures seemed to form in the periphery, echoes of the countless souls trapped alongside her, all tied to the land's sorrow. Yet as the rancher continued, speaking the names, recounting the tragedies, and tracing the signs of remembrance, the oppressive energy began to shift. The woman's form pulsed, flickering between the living and the spectral. For the first time she smiled, a small fleeting expression that was more human than he had ever seen. "Thank you," she whispered, a sound that carried both relief and sorrow. The shadows recoiled, dissipating into the corners of the cabin, the oppressive weight lifting with each word of acknowledgement he offered. The wind outside slowed, the roar diminishing to a cold, steady whisper. The dog cautiously approached her, sniffing at her form as if sensing that the danger had lessened. Even the horses outside calmed, stamping gently in the dirt, their eyes bright and unafraid. The oppressive heaviness that had gripped the ranch for days finally began to fade. She stepped closer to the rancher, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. Her voice was barely audible now, a whisper carried on the fading wind. "You have seen me. You have understood. That is enough." The glow that had made her presence unnatural faded, revealing her once more as a fragile human form, pale and weary, but real. And then she was gone, not violently, not in a rush of shadows, but softly, as if the air itself had carried her away. The cabin felt empty, the silence profound yet calm. The rancher sank to the floor, exhausted, but alive, the weight of the past lifted yet leaving, a residue of awe and respect. The curse had not been destroyed, it was part of the land, but it had been acknowledged, its cycle interrupted for now. The rancher understood that the property he had called home for decades was more than soil and stone. It was a living memory, a repository of sorrow, and a place where the unseen could dwell. And he, the lone observer, had become its witness, its participant, and perhaps in some way its guardian. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying a whisper that he would never forget. "Let me die here." The ranch had returned to a fragile calm. The wind still whispered through the pines, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and frost, but the oppressive weight that had pressed against the cabin for days was gone. The shadows no longer twisted unnaturally across. The walls and the fire burned steadily, throwing steady light across the room, yet the rancher knew that the calm was temporary, fragile and deceptive. Days passed, but he could not shake the memory of her presence. Every time he stepped outside, the land seemed different, alive in subtle ways he had never noticed before. The hills, the woods, even the soil beneath his boots seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the past, the countless cycles of death, suffering, and unresolved history, was still present, woven into the very fabric of the ranch. He felt their gaze everywhere, shadows of lives long gone, and the echo of her words lingered in his mind. "Let me die here." The animals were wary. The dog, once fearless and obedient, now paused at corners of the cabin, ears pricked, as though sensing things unseen. The horses, calm in the daylight, occasionally snorted and stamped when the wind shifted in unnatural ways. Even the chickens, usually oblivious, scattered at inexplicable sounds. The rancher had grown to understand that the land retained memory, and whatever had inhabited it before her arrival had not entirely departed. He returned to his routines, tending fences, feeding the animals, and walking the land on horseback. Yet each action was tinged with awareness, a heightened sensitivity to the unseen. He no longer felt alone, not in the ordinary sense. The ranch was a place of quiet power, of lingering spirits, and he had become both caretaker and witness to a history that refused to vanish. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the trees, reminded him that some presences could not be banished. They could only be acknowledged. Nights were the hardest. In the dark, the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer than before, and the wind carried whispers faint enough to be mistaken for imagination. Sometimes, in the corner of his vision, he would see a figure standing still, watching, just beyond the glow of the lantern. He never turned to confront it, and it never moved closer, but the sensation was enough to remind him that the events of that night had altered the balance of the ranch forever. He began to leave offerings, a small token of respect placed on the old journals, a careful arrangement of stones in the corners of the cabin, subtle acknowledgments of the unseen. It was not superstition exactly. It was awareness. He had seen the consequences of neglect, and he understood that some forces required more than brute strength or isolation. They required attention, recognition, and a willingness to bear witness without seeking reward or explanation. Yet despite these precautions, unease lingered. The memory of her half-decayed form, the pulsing shadows, the whispers of the trapped souls, they haunted his dreams. He awoke in cold sweats, certain that she was near, pleading, waiting, or perhaps testing him. The phrase replayed endlessly in his mind, a mantra he could neither forget nor dismiss. "Let me die here." He understood finally that the ranch would always be haunted, not in the dramatic cinematic sense, but in the subtle, persistent way that memory persists in stone and soil. The past had imprinted itself upon the land, and he was now part of its history, a reluctant guardian of its secrets. He had survived the night, but survival did not mean mastery. The echoes remained, and some nights when the wind shifted just so, he swore he could hear her whisper carried through the trees, soft but insistent, a plea that would never end. And so he lived, tending the ranch, acknowledging the land and its memories, aware that the unseen could watch him, test him, or simply exist alongside him. Life went on, but he carried with him the understanding that the balance between the living and the restless dead was delicate, and the echoes of her presence, and countless others, would endure far beyond his own lifetime. The wind sighed through the pines once more, and for a fleeting moment he thought he heard her voice, "Let me die here." And he knew she had, in a way, finally been seen.